Hello. In this video, I'm going to talk about the coefficient of variation, the tool we can use to compare the risk and return of two different random variables. This video will follow the reading on page 599 in section 14.2 of the textbook. So what have we done so far? So far, we talked about measures of the return, that is the expected value of a random variable, and also measure of risk, that is the standard deviation of the random variable. And so we can use these two measures to compare two random variables to each other, but there are limitations to do so. For instance, if we go back to the example from the previous video, we had two stocks that had the same expected return of 250, the first one having a smaller standard deviation than the second one. So in the case of identical expected returns, a random variable, that is the dividend to a stock in my particular example, will be less risky if the standard deviation is smaller. So these two stocks have the same expected return, but B is more risky because B has a higher standard deviation. So when the expected returns are the same, we have a good way of comparing two random variables. Let's look at the opposite example. Suppose I'm giving you two other stocks, stock X and stock Y, and X has an expected return of 750, Y has an expected return of 550, but they have the standard deviation of 100 each. So we can also make a comparison. In this example, we can say they have the same risk, but X has a higher return than Y. So presumably, X is going to be preferable because for the same level of risk, it yields a higher payoff in the future. But so we don't have a way to compare stocks that have different expected returns and different risk levels at the same time. For instance, let's look at the following example. Stock C has an expected return of 500 and a risk measure of 100. Stock D has a return of 250 and a risk measure of only 40. So C is offering a higher expected return, but also a higher risk level associated with it. So how do we compare stocks like C and D? To do so, we have a new measure that's called the coefficient of variation, which simply takes your standard deviation and divides it by the expected value. So risk divided by the expected return. And so that would measure the relative risk of a random variable. Let's calculate the coefficient of variation for the two stocks in previous example. Stock C, coefficient of variation, standard deviation is 100, expected return is 500, so the ratio is 100 over 500, or just 0.2. For stock D, the standard deviation is 40, the expected return is 250, so the ratio is 40 divided by 250, 0.16. What can we see from this comparison? First of all, the coefficient of variation is smaller for stock D. That makes stock D relatively less risky compared to stock C. You can also interpret it the following way. Stock C has twice the return of stock D. 500 compared to 250 is 2 times as large. But in terms of comparing risks, the risk associated with stock C is 2.5 times the risk associated with stock D. So stock C offers twice the return of stock D at the cost of 2.5 times the risk. So that makes stock C relatively more risky than stock D. And the comparison of the coefficient of variations does the job of uncovering it. Thank you.